Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Nathaniel Moore. I'm an archivist at the Ethnic Studies Library at UC Berkeley and the Freedom Archives in San Francisco. I'm excited to be here today to moderate what will be a dynamic and informative conversation about Arab American studies, Palestine, and the fight for ethnic studies. This webinar was organized by the Arab American Studies Association, along with the Arab Resource and Organizing Center and the Save Arab American Studies Coalition. So I wanted to say thank you to all those parties, and thank you to everyone else who contributed to making this possible, who's joining us today. So this is one of a series of webinars organized around the California Ethnic Studies model curriculum and the concerted efforts to exclude Arab American studies from that curriculum. At this point, we know that the model curriculum that will be unveiled at the California Board of Education's upcoming meeting on Thursday is entirely insufficient for our communities and our young people. As you heard ethnic studies educators and practitioners speak to on our webinar last Friday, the current draft not only has entirely removed Arab American and Pacific Islanders, but also no longer meets the standards, the values, and the pedagogy of critical ethnic studies put forth, not just by the original writers of the curriculum, but also by the founders of ethnic studies. One of our key demands of the California Department of Education is to establish a transparent and accountable process that is driven by scholars and experts in the field. And that's been a group that has been excluded from participation in the most recent revisions. So we're going to talk about ways that you can participate in the struggle as we get towards the end of the webinar. But for now, I want to shift to why we're here today, which is to uplift the longstanding relationship of Arab American studies to the larger field of ethnic studies and centering Palestine and the movement for Palestinian liberation as fundamental to broader struggles for racial justice. And so joining us today, we've got 5 scholars from across a number of disciplines that are going to help guide us through these connections and help us understand the implications of the struggle. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists, and each of them are going to give some opening remarks, and then we'll all break into a kind of a moderated conversation. If you have questions that you're interested in, if we can try to get to, don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. All right, so to start us off with, I want to introduce Amira Jarmakani. She's a professor of women and gender and sexuality studies at San Diego State University, the author of An Imperious Love Story, Desert Romances and the War on Terror. She has also authored Imagining Arab Womanhood, the Cultural Mythology of Veils, Harems, and Belly Dancers in the US, and that won a National Women's Studies Association Book Prize. She's the current president of the Arab American Studies Association and a series advisor for the Critical Arab American Studies series that appears with Syracuse University Press. So Amira, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your introduction, Nathaniel, and also to Lara Kiswani and Iraq for helping to organize this as well. I'm just going to give some broad overview comments. Thanks to all of you for coming, for joining as well to hear us today. I wanted to, in my comments, just lay out, for many of you probably already are familiar with this, but lay out an outline of why Arab American Studies is part of ethnic studies. And along the way, I'll address some of the pushback that we've received in terms of making that claim, really, that true claim. And in order to do that, as Nathaniel mentioned, one of the things that I need to do ahead of time is just ask the question, what is ethnic studies? And it's important to ask this because one of the aims of the attacks overall has been to water down and dilute the notion, the whole sense of ethnic studies at all, into a question of diversity and multiculturalism, basically what Third World Liberation Front striker Nesbitt Crutchfield at Friday's panel described as that inclusion bullshit, and that is a direct quote. And I would also just add that in terms of the ethnic studies curriculum, the revisions themselves, what has happened with them, again, as Nathaniel mentioned, Teresa Montano, one of the original drafters of the ethnic studies model curriculum, has described these revisions as, which have all but removed Arab American and Pacific Islander studies. She described those revisions as an all lives matter version of an ethnic studies curriculum because of the way it's restructured the whole notion of what ethnic studies even is, according to the incorrect framing of diversity, multiculturalism, inclusion, and so on. So one of the main impacts of that watered down and obfuscating framing of what ethnic studies actually is has been a retrenchment to the original four groups, we could say, or that shouldn't be in scare quotes, but the original four groups of African American or Africana studies, Indigenous studies, Chicanic, Latinx studies, and Asian American studies. And so along with that, there have also been some efforts I want to name, like the recent petition that is circulating now at the CSU system level to assert that Arab American studies is actually part of this watered down inclusion version, which is actually of not ethnic studies. What they're claiming is ethnic studies, but which is not ethnic studies. So Arab American studies is part of ethnic studies as aligned with its central tenets of analyzing and breaking down structural and systemic oppressions, challenging imperialist and colonialist frameworks. These are two of the key main things that we want to think about. And so along with that idea of analyzing and breaking down structural and systemic oppression, we need to understand the question of racialization of Arab Americans. So we would need to back up and think about race as a social fact, which therefore means it is mutable and malleable sort of thing that is, and racialization itself as a process, right? So here I'm gonna more specifically talk about Arab Americans and Arab American studies. And in the case of Arab Americans and people from Swana or Southwest Asia, North Africa more widely, due to the absence of a racial category so far sort of legally in the United States, one has to highlight evidence of racialization in social structures, right? In laws and policies, actions, and stereotypes, dominant ideologies that get expressed through media and otherwise. And so in that case, I want to just sort of outline some of those laws, policies, actions, and things and the way that they are structurally enacted. And as I do this, you will start to see also some of the parallels between Arab American studies and Asian American studies, which is, it will become important for the way that we're gonna think through this as well. So one of the first things we would wanna think through in terms of policies could be exclusionary immigration policies, right? So the very contemporary so-called Muslim ban, we can understand as a logical extension of earlier bans like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Muslim ban operates through Orientalist logics of white supremacy that are also bound up with militarization and militarism and military action, right? But while that's a very contemporary example, it also has roots in the categorization of Swana, so again, Southwest Asia and North Africa, but also particularly Southwest Asian people as Asiatic and West Asian people as Asiatic, that their categorization as such in 1910 and ongoing legal battles, including in the Supreme Court, which variously labeled Arabs, Turks, and South Asians as non-white, either based on the notions about supposedly scientific notions about race and Caucasia or what Caucasian means, or also based on literal skin color and common perceptions about what that meant about race, remembering that race is a social fact. So those scientific notions of race often sought to locate whiteness in discourses of geographic and ethnic purity and so on, right? So I want to be, let me be clear, let us be clear. Racial categorization in relation to Swana has long been unstable, and there are many histories of particularly West Asian immigrants to the States seeking citizenship and belonging and official white status. And insofar as they have done that, there have been a participation in anti-Blackness. And this question of that kind of participation is also critical ethnic studies work, right? And in terms of understanding, again, racialization and its processes. Another, just to go back to that overall framing of racialization as a process, looking at laws, policies, actions, stereotypes, and ideologies and things. We could also think about and would want to understand militarization and racialized surveillance of Arab Americans and anyone perceived to be so Swana Americans as well. Here we could go into kind of the connections that lead us here. And again, these are histories that I'm sure many of you watching today already know, but I'm just going to sort of talk through them really quickly. We could think about the ways that, for instance, global events after World War I, the French and British colonization of what came to be labeled as the Middle East, and the Middle East, of course, is a referential geographical term rooted in Orientalism as a construction of Easts, right? And also you could think about the events after World War II, in particular, the creation of the State of Israel in Palestine, which forced some 700,000 at least Palestinians to flee into exile. Understanding these, and in conjunction with the emergence of the US as a global superpower, it worked, the US that is largely in tandem with European colonialist powers and interests to undermine anti-colonial and anti-imperialist pan-Arab movements. And those pan-Arab movements are also critical to how we understand the category of Arab American as it comes to be seen. And so we would also want to mention that while a huge blow to the pan-Arab movement internationally, the 1967 Israeli conquest of the rest of Palestine, as well as parts of Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, in addition to the official US government and mainstream media treatment of these events, mobilized and galvanized what we might call a pan-Arab American movement, as migrants from West Asia and North Africa had up until that point in the US mostly identified, self-identified, or been identified by national origin. I'll just give personal example, like as in Syrian American. And it's important to mention that Asian American as a category had also followed a similar trajectory in terms of that pan categorical construction. So the long list of events that followed, and here we could add so many, but including and but not not excluding others, including but not limited to the oil boycott of the 1970s, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the 1991 Gulf War, the subsequent US sanctions of Iraq, the US invasion of Iraq, US support for Israeli occupation of Palestine, US support for Saudi-led airstrikes on Yemen. All of these things contribute to what some colleagues of mine have said, Louise Kenker and Pauline Humphrey Vincent have described that while we think of the war on terror as being contemporary, the so-called war on terror unofficially commenced in the 1960s, right? So we want to understand this sort of broader construction as well. And the reason I mention this is because one of the challenges we've faced is people saying, well, you're arguing that you're racialized and you're racially surveilled, but this has only been happening like since 2001. So the portrayal of all of these events created a stereotypical demonizing of Arabs in media. And that's another sort of aspect of the structural racialization of Arabs and Swana folks more broadly, or anyone imagined to be such. And that has created a climate of hostility and pervasive racialized surveillance, which has had all kinds of implications, and they're ongoing and include all kinds of lists of, homes and religious centers being bombed and vandalized, individuals being threatened, beaten, and murdered in assaults, and all kinds of other actions, including programs like CVE and so on. So all of these laws, policies, actions, dominant notions of Arabs and Arab Americans are the evidence of racialized exclusion of Arab and Swana Americans more generally, though wanted to also note that our ambiguous legal and categorical status has rendered us, as Helen Hattab Samhan said, not quite white, or as Nadine Neber framed it, ambiguous insiders, and as sociologist Ian Haney Lopez, referring to Latinx populations mostly, has described as white by law. So those categorizations have meant that Arab American experiences of racialization have largely been invisibilized. And this is another key point here in terms of making the claim for why we're part of ethnic studies when we've been so invisibilized, partly through lack of a category or lack of a legal categories, for instance, on the US Census. So there has been ongoing efforts to be named on that. And not having a category in the census, of course, excludes our communities from access to resources in relation to racial justice accounting. But also really critically, it has silenced us, right? And one of the main ways this has manifested is through censorship of anything related to Palestine, as we saw with the attacks on the ethnic studies model curriculum, and in particular on lesson plans related to the BDS campaign, and even hip hop artists talking about the occupation of Palestine, and also on some of the singling out some of the people who have drafted that ethnic studies model curriculum, in particular Samia Shoman. So well before and beyond the ethnic studies model curriculum, though, this type of censorship has long silenced Arab American scholars within academia. And perhaps more importantly, in terms of the question that has been posed to us about why we don't have programs if we are part of ethnic studies, it has excluded us from joining academia to begin with if we haven't been admitted to programs, either because people within academia refuse to work with us or refuse to support our work once we got in, resulting in uncounted numbers of scholars who have left academia, or they wouldn't hire us in academic positions once we finished, and or they fired or quote unquote unhired us, as in the case of Stephen Salaita, even after he had established an impeccable record of publishing and scholarship. So I did want to name that Arab American Studies has found institutional homes within Asian American Studies for some of the reasons listed above, and that's why I gestured to that. Then, so the early waves of immigration were mostly from West Asia. Processes of racialization and white by law status were understood through these rubrics, and also Orientalism and racialization have occurred mostly through militarization, and that's another parallel with and reason why we would resonate with Asian American studies. Ideally, though, we would have more freestanding programs, and I want to name that there are freestanding programs like the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas program at San Francisco State University, directed by Rabab Abdul Hadi, the Arab and Muslim American Studies at the University of Michigan, directed by Suad Abdul Khabir and formerly by Evelyn Sultani and co-opened with Nadine Neber, and the Center for Arab American Studies at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, directed by Sally Howell. So ideally, those would be joined by many others. And I would just note that the Third World Liberation Front strikers called for decolonial studies. They called for Third World Studies, which manifested as ethnic studies in those four groups previously named, but also left room for other programs as would become necessary within this rubric, this larger rubric of what ethnic studies actually is. So I would just close out by talking about another main tenet of ethnic studies being solidarity, that at the strikers themselves, the Third World Liberation Front strikers themselves, did include among them Arab Americans and pan-Arab, in terms of pan-Arab anti-colonial nationalism, and that I would name also that a decolonial framework, as was put forward by the strikers, is not just about imperialism over there, it's really important to say. It's also about the ways imperialist policies and actions impact racialized communities in the US. And when we bring up the fact that ethnic studies has its roots in the Third World Liberation Front, which asks for third world studies, we're often in Arab American studies quickly reminded that the curriculum is about the US and not over there, as a reminder that just reaffirms the ways that Arab Americans are understood as perpetually foreign. So I think that response to us has sort of underscored that. And the connections that Arab Americans made during the Third World Liberation Front strikes are also manifested in examples, and here I'll just name one from Sarah Gualtieri's most recent book, like Syrian American George Shibley, who was the defense attorney for the so-called Sleepy Lagoon case, in which 21 Mexican Americans were charged and 17 of those convicted. of murdering a man, and they were charged largely based on racist stereotypes about Mexican Americans as violent, casting them as being parts of gangs, as foreign, and as part of a fifth column. And all of these things resonate with the ways that Arab Americans are racialized as well. So we can see these kinds of intersections, collusions, and interdependencies among policing, militarism, and US imperialism. Popular discourses that associate SWANA identified people with terrorism all too easily feed into US state policies that attempt to criminalize social justice organizing like the Black Lives Matter movement. And parallels also exist between prison and military industrial complexes and the warehousing strategies in domestic prisons targeting Black communities, in military and domestic prisons holding enemy combatants and suspected terrorists, and in the detention centers holding Latinx and SWANA immigrants likewise. So thanks so much.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive and hit upon so many important points. And thank you for sharing the Sleepy Lagoon historical fact. I didn't know that. That's very interesting. So we're going to hear from next Christine Hong, who's an associate professor of literature and director of critical race and ethnic studies and co-director of the new Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz. She is the author of A Violent Peace, Race, Militarism, and Cultures of Democratization in Cold War Asia and the Pacific. And then she has also co-directed the Legacies of the Korean War Oral History Project with Deanne Borsche-Liam, and served on the board of directors of the Korea Policy Institute, which is an independent research and educational institute. She also co-edits a journal of critical ethnic studies. So another accomplished panelist. Christine, we're gonna throw it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Lara and Amira, for organizing this space. I want to begin by stating that when we talk about the origins of ethnic studies, we have to think, as Amira was saying, about the fact that ethnic studies wasn't framed as ethnic studies, it was framed as third world studies. And so I think that there's a danger of a kind of conservative originalism that we are seeing right now in terms of the critique of the ethnic studies model curriculum. And I think that what we should avoid is taking a kind of posture toward the origins of ethnic studies the way that conservative Supreme Court justices argue an originalist interpretation of the Constitution. That's not what's at play here. I would just add to what Amira was saying that ethnic studies as a third world liberation movement was in no way, shape, or form supposed to be a static formation, much less any kind of institution that reproduced the status quo. At the very core of ethnic studies as a radical democratic project was political education and anti-imperialist critique. When you think about what the Third World Liberation Front strikers had to confront in terms of state violence, that alone tells you how much of a threat ethnic studies was viewed as. You know, at SF State, I always say this to students at Santa Cruz when I'm making the rounds speaking about our new, relatively new program in critical race and ethnic studies. At SF State, as you know, everyone knows this who's probably listening in today, but you know, the school administration deployed a tactical squad of the SFPD that was trained in counterinsurgency techniques that had been deployed in the US War of Intervention in Vietnam. And the purpose was to break bones and to shed blood. And at Berkeley, then Governor Ronald Reagan deployed, and this is familiar to us in our current moment, the National Guard. And so this is just to emphasize the fact that it was precisely ethnic studies as a liberatory political project that struck this kind of fear into the powers that be. So we're not talking about ethnic studies as, you know, a kind of project of endless inclusion, but ethnic studies that even at its origins critically recognize the operations of racial capitalism. And as you know, many scholars have said in the decades since, the logic and operations of racial capitalism are promiscuous and they're flexible. They don't always operate through outright exclusion, but oftentimes through multicultural inclusion. So that is a danger. But this is just to hold true, not to ethnic studies as some sort of transformed, tepid, multicultural project, but to understand that at its roots, it was profoundly critical. And that is the spirit in which the committee members of the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Advisory Committee members intended it to be. That is the kind of response that communities of color throughout the state have given in support of that Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum as well. I want to say another thing too, which I mentioned just a moment ago, and it's that we can't discount the fact that the Third World Liberation Front strike happened during a time of US imperialist war, when the grotesque violence of this interventionist war was on the global stage for all the world to see. And so this is just to emphasize the fact that ethnic studies has anti-imperialism at its core. It's when we understand ethnic studies, not in some sort of tepid multicultural way, but we understand it in terms of its third world roots, that we understand the place of Palestine within third world studies. It's a no-brainer to say that all of the veterans of, you know, the strikes at SF State and at Berkeley would have had their eye on Palestine and would have understood Zionism as a form of imperialism and settler colonialism. And indeed, if you even look at ProQuest and you look at the earliest mentions of the term settler colonialism, they almost all appear in the early 1970s onward in reference specifically to Palestine. And, you know, as all of us can say, settler colonialism is absolutely central as a critical analytic to the larger field of ethnic studies. I want to say too, and here to echo what Amira was saying, that Asian American studies does not do justice to either Arab American studies or to Pacific Islander studies. It doesn't hegemonically subsume either field. Neither is a subfield of Asian American studies. When you think about Arab American studies, particularly with regard to Palestine, when you think about Pacific Islander studies, specifically with regard to sites like Hawaii and Samoa, these are fields that enable a deep conversation around settler colonialism. But as Amira was saying, Asian American studies, and you know, here I would say Arab American studies, Pacific Islander studies, these are all fields that are profoundly conditioned by US interventionist violence, by US militarism. And there is a conversation, an organic conversation that occurs among these fields. I want to just point out too that it was AAAS, the Association for Asian American Studies, that was the first national academic organization that came out formally in support of BDS. It's also the case, I want to say too, that AAAS recently, this past year, supported a resolution calling for an end to the ongoing Korean War. There is a kind of logic there that knits these resolutions together. And I think that what we have to think about is really how the racism of US foreign policy, how US intervention racializes. And it racializes not only in terms of the target abroad or over there, as Amira was saying, but it racializes in terms of racial profiling, gatekeeping here in the construction of internal enemies, right? And so we have to think about the target and racial profiling as drawing from the same logic. I think that for those of us who are within ethnic studies, you can't imagine that post 9/11, not to exceptionalize that moment, but it's unthinkable that post 9/11 that you would not be thinking so centrally about Arab American studies in conversation with racial profiling, the broad assignment of guilt that we understand with regard to that, and to understand that that kind of broad catch-all dragnet surveillance, the kind of punitive approach, we can understand how that would resonate within Asian American studies with Japanese Americans whose parents or themselves were subjected to mass incarceration during World War II. I want to mention something else that occurred post 9/11. George W. Bush not him, but his speechwriter came up with that pithy phrase, axis of evil. And, commentators were, poo-pooing this expression, suggesting that it was such an arbitrary grouping. It's actually not an arbitrary grouping to have North Korea, Iraq, Iran, East Asia, West Asia, sites that have been targeted by the US war machine, populations that have been subjected to long histories of securitization, with people sorted into good and bad categories, which is a racializing process. It's not a coincidence to have those placed in conversation, lumped together in one grouping. I want to end by speaking a little bit, just briefly, about the motivated agenda in terms of this attack on the ethnic studies model curriculum that is motivated by the inclusion of BDS and Palestine. This is a concerted effort that has been led by American Zionist organizations that I think that we have to understand as and place in a kind of critical context. I come from UC Santa Cruz. I started there as an assistant professor about a decade ago. And I remember one time when Hatem Bazian of UC Berkeley came to speak at UC Santa Cruz, and there was an event that was co-sponsored by what was then called CJP instead of SJP, the Committee for Justice in Palestine, as well as the Muslim Students Association. And when it came time for the Q&A, what happened was the students passed out note cards, like little sort of 3x5 note cards, and those were all jotted down, and the Q&A was very, very tightly monitored, and there was anxiety in the room. There's anxiety in the room because Santa Cruz is also the home to the founder of the AMHA initiative, Tammy Rossman Benjamin, who was in the audience at that event and others that I was present at. And Tammy Rossman Benjamin, as some of you may know, is behind this organization, as I said, AMHA, which basically has conflated any critique within academia of Zionism with anti-Semitism. But not only has she done this and her organization done this and launched numerous lawsuits against the UC, et cetera, but also, as was captured in a video that was posted to the internet by her supporters, she basically terror baited Muslim and Palestinian students. She said that MSA and SJP were linked to terrorist organizations. If we think about this, so Tammy Rossman Benjamin has had airtime in the San Francisco Chronicle, basically taking down the ethnic studies model curriculum. But if we think about how this kind of agenda basically has terror baited Palestinian and Muslim students within the United States, we have to think about ethnic studies scholars like Lisa Marie Cacho, who speak about this kind of terrorist sort of moniker, this kind of labeling as a form of social death. And when you use that kind of terminology to target populations, you are consenting to unbridled state violence against those subjects. And I want to say one last thing that hits home, which is that last year when I first heard about this, when I was speaking to Topeka Queltine, who has been so tireless in organizing on behalf of the model curriculum, it came to my attention that there were Korean American organizations that were apparently strange bedfellows with Zionist organizations in critiquing the ethnic studies model curriculum. One was a Christian Zionist Korean American organization, and the other one was the Korean American Coalition. And the Korean American Coalition is an organization, it's a big organization down in LA, it's a conservative one, that basically has supported US sanctions against North Korea. And it's these kinds of bedfellows that have come out in sort of a very strange, very odd multicultural alliance with Zionist organizations, but that doesn't actually demonstrate Korean American or Korean diasporic support for the model curriculum and Korean American, Korean diasporic support for the liberation of Palestine. So I just wanted to mention that the Korea Policy Institute, Education for Social Justice, which is a Comfort Woman educational organization, Hobak, Hella Organized Bay Area Koreans, Eclipse Rising, a Zainichi Korean organization, Nodatul, a longtime major organization in New York, all came out in support of the ethnic studies model curriculum. Koreans in the diaspora understand all too well, as do Palestinians, about the painful impact of partition. And I'm going to end right there.
Thank you, Christine. And thanks for bringing up some of the really important history of the Third World Liberation Front and grounding us in that project. And I also just wanted to raise, since you brought up the all of the Zionist attacks against Palestinian speech in higher ed, Palestine Legal, which is an organization that documents these attacks and tries to defend folks against them. When they released a report a couple years ago, they found that there were over 1,200 of such incidents in a 4-year period between 2014 and 2018 of suppression of speech related to Palestine on campus. So it's really, a vital connection to this conversation. Next, we've got Keith Feldman, who's going to join us. He's an associate professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley and the author of A Shadow Over Palestine, The Imperial Life of Race in America. That was awarded the Best Book in Humanities and Cultural Studies by the Association of Asian American Studies. And Keith publishes widely in the areas of critical studies, Arab American studies, and Palestine studies. He's the current secretary of the Arab American Studies Association. So welcome.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Lara and Amira, for all the organizing, and thank you, Nathaniel, for moderating. And thanks to the almost 120 people who are tuning in. It's really wonderful to have you here. So A bit about how I come to this conversation. I've worked as a scholar in the field of Arab American studies for the last 15 years. My first peer-reviewed publication in 2006 focused on the legal and cultural legibility or illegibility of Arab Americans in early 20th century racial discourse. My first book, researched and written over the better part of a decade, was in large part a cultural history of representations of Palestine and Palestinians in the United States, focusing especially on the period from the 1960s to the 1980s. And I want to talk just a little bit about what I do in that book. So there, I demonstrate how post-civil rights visions of and challenges to multiracial democracy in the US became entangled with movements for Palestinian freedom and self-determination, especially after the 1967 war. In the context of what Black studies scholar Manning Marable once called the Second Reconstruction, a wide range of authors, communities, and social movements struggled to challenge embedded systems of white supremacy in the US and the circuits of US imperialism operating globally. Even as the US state and certain quarters of civil society deepened their investments, sometimes affective investments, sometimes material investments in Israel and the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. Formal racialized inclusion in the United States was conjoined with the deepening racialized exclusion of Palestine and Palestinians. So in that context, Arab and Palestinian writers and organizations struggled to make legible their own complex histories and visions of the future outside the frames of an increasingly hostile US political culture. And I turn in the book to the work of the Palestine Research Center based in Beirut, to a group of Arab American feminists, including Carol Haddad and her organization called FAN, to an organization called the Association of Arab American University Graduates, founded in 1968, and of course to Edward Said. Now, both Said and the AAUG, with whom Said worked on and off, they argued that a fulsome sense of humanism could only be achieved by challenging racism and colonialism in all their forms, including in the structures of settler colonialism that radically delimited the horizons of Palestinian life. For something like multiracial democracy to stand half a chance would require Palestine's future flourishing. So I was overjoyed last year as a scholar working in the field and also as a parent of 2 kids in California public schools when I saw the first draft of the Ethnic Studies model curriculum, including its rich Arab American Studies course outline. And I was disheartened when I saw a familiar pattern of orchestrated demonization and disqualification, a pattern going back decades that once again emerged. So I took some time in advance of our session today to once again review that draft, particularly in light of the proposed revisions. And I really just want to make 3 points in conversation with that first draft ethnic studies model curriculum. So the first thing is that the Arab American Studies course outline is outstanding. It is grounded in decades of scholarship in the field. It's well organized. It's richly developed. As a reminder to those of you who haven't seen it lately, the proposal includes 4 fully developed lesson plans laid out carefully over 50 pages. The lesson plans cover the history of Arab American immigration, a portrait of Arab and Muslim Americans and the challenges they've faced, an investigation of Islamophobia, and a wonderfully creative unit on hip hop as resistance, introducing students to the ways anti-Arab stereotypes are both embedded and challenged in US popular culture. Students do work on maps to trace histories of migration from West Asia and North Africa to the US. They read first-person accounts from the likes of Amira Jarmakani, early 20th century Arab-American writer, Rashida Tlaib, and a medical student named Zafir Handi El-Sabawi. They're invited to produce a public service announcement about identifying and combating Islamophobia. At the end of the unit on hip hop, they're invited to create an audio soundtrack about how hegemony has affected their lives. They're asked to write lyrics, to draw a CD album cover, and even produce the songs. Overall, the course outline is robust and well formulated. When my colleagues and I in the Arab American Studies Association's executive board learned about the curriculum, it's safe to say we were absolutely awestruck, hopeful that this kind of pedagogy would be a model for courses nationally. So that's the first point. Second point, where is Palestine in this course outline? First, it's embedded in the wider histories of Arab migration, labor, and social movement. It is a part, one small, crucial, constituent part of a much larger Arab American Studies curriculum, alongside work about Syrians, Lebanese, Egyptians, Yemenis, Iraqis, and situated in relation to histories of US warfare and empire in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and an important juxtaposition to the framing of Afghanistan and Iran. I really can't stress enough that students would learn so much from the lessons in this course. Palestine also appears very briefly in the context of social justice movements. The call to develop nonviolent practices of boycott, divestment, and sanctions until Israel abides by international law is introduced as one of 12 potential social movements for students to study, alongside other movements like the Occupy movement, the Defend Science or Climate movement, the Me Too movement, the Standing Rock movement, etc. Likewise, BDS is one of 15 sample topics that could be taken up in the Arab American Studies course outline, alongside key laws, executive orders, the important differences between Arab and Muslim, etc. Now, of course, it's these latter moments in the draft that have drawn such ire from its critics, along with a poorly translated line from the Palestinian artist Shadi Mansour about the role of the media in perpetuating anti-Palestinian stereotypes. So that's the second point. The third is that I fear it was these brief moments when Palestine and Palestinians are put into a wider context, given depth, complexity, nuanced, that these were the things that were seized upon in the public comments about the draft. You'll see at the very beginning of August, when the new revisions were released, the CDE released a series of documents, including an accounting of the public comments that they'd received on the first draft. And in the CDE's own accounting of the comments they received, 18,927 were concerned with a lack of inclusion of Jewish Americans and anti-Semitism, and concerns with the inclusion of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Right? All of these were clumped together. 18,457 of those comments were received in a 2-month period last summer. Now, to couple these two concerns, one acknowledging the absence of an idea, anti-Semitism, largely absent, though it's there in the glossary and elsewhere in the draft, as well as the absence of a community, Jewish Americans, though again, Jewish Americans are there, and the other about the presence of a social movement, BDS, this is really pretty mediocre bookkeeping at best, and it's deeply unfortunate at worst. Now, the only categories of support that the CDE catalogs for us from the comments that they received are: one, for the ethnic studies model curriculum or ethnic studies in general. They received 419 of those comments. Or two, support for the coverage of Arab Americans in the 2019 draft. About 116 before the public comment period initially closed last August, and over 8,500 from between mid-August of last year and the end of July, just a few weeks ago. In fact, the support, the 8,500 has a little plus. It just lost count of all the support that has been coming in. Now, troublingly, the press release accompanying the revised draft at the beginning of August notes that, quote, based on stakeholder feedback, the CDE has recommended removing all language that can be perceived as anti-Semitic, end quote. For the Arab American Studies course outline to be erased from the new draft flies in the face of public sentiment, again, according to the CDE's own accounting. But not only that, it marginalizes the perspectives of the scholarly experts in the field of ethnic studies, Arab American studies, and Asian American studies among them. And perhaps most perniciously of all, it suggests that it might be perceived as anti-Semitic to study Arab American histories, lives, cultures, and politics. As my parents might say, oy vey. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you for that. And thank you for specifically bringing up some of the rich lessons that were included previously in the curriculum. And I think that's really important information that we know. And also it really resonates keeping with the continuity of the original creation of ethnic studies about the empowerment of young people. And that, I think that empowerment really rang through in some of those lessons. Thank you for those comments. Our next speaker is going to be Alex Lubin, who's a professor of African American Studies at Penn State University. From 2011 to 2014, he directed the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University in Beirut. He's the author of 3 books, including a forthcoming title from UC Press, The Never-Ending War on Terror, and he's co-author or editor of a number of volumes, including The Futures of Black Radicalism, which you can find at Verso Books. So please help us in welcoming Alex.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be on this panel with these distinguished speakers. And I want to thank Arock and Keith and Amira for organizing and inviting me. I have a bit of a different approach to responding to the questions that we were asked to discuss. I could talk a little bit about my research on Afro-Arab politics and why I think Arab American studies and the question of Palestine in particular ought to be and is a central concern for Black studies in particular. And I will get to that, but I want to talk actually a little bit more autobiographically, although I'm the only person on the panel not currently in California, and I'm a bit bitter about that. I was someone who grew up in California, and I'm a product of the public school districts in Berkeley, California, where I graduated high school. And when I was in high school, although we didn't have an ethnic studies curriculum, it was a very long time ago, we did have a Black studies curriculum that had been fought for by graduate students at San Francisco State University who became teachers at Berkeley High School. And so with Richard Navies and others, there was a robust Black studies curriculum at Berkeley High School. But I was also shaped, my ideas about social movements and racial politics were also shaped by activist experiences with Arab Americans in and around the Bay Area that really foreground the importance of relational politics and transnational solidarities. And so this is where I'll get a little bit personal. Some of you may know that in addition to being someone who's written some books, I'm also the child of someone who was part of a social movement for justice in Palestine, Barbara Lubin, who founded the Middle East Children's Alliance in 1986. And my mother is a Jewish woman who grew up in a Zionist household, but who was radical in all sorts of ways. She was the president of the Berkeley School District. She brought lawsuits against that school district when they failed to educate my brother who has Down syndrome. And those lawsuits led in part to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. My mother was a sanctuary movement advocate, supporting immigrant rights for people from El Salvador and Honduras. She had done all sorts of radical things. She brought commercial rent control to Berkeley, California before it was struck down by the California Supreme Court. She'd done remarkable activist work, but was always silent on the question of Israel-Palestine until around 1984, 85, when graduate students from San Francisco State, who had been part of the AAUG there, approached her and said, "You are radical on all of these things, but you have said nothing about Palestine ever in your life. Why?" And, you know, my mother was raised in a Zionist household where, you know, she wasn't politicized around Palestine in any way, and everything was done on behalf of Israel. And she said to the graduate students, you know, what would I say? I'm Jewish. This is not an issue that has anything to do with me. And so over time, the graduate students convinced her to go on a delegation with them to Palestine. To make a long story short, while she was there, she visited the forests that her family had been supporting tree growth on, planting trees as part of the Jewish National Fund her whole life. And she realized that it was on top of a Palestinian village. And that led to a break with Zionism, and she returned quickly and formed the Middle East Children's Alliance with people like Edward Said and Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky on the organizing board. The point of this story is that Arab Americans were and have been and are part of the activist communities that made up multicultural and the radical Bay Area throughout the period of the Third World Liberation Movement. And the AUG has a history in the formation of ethnic studies that I think we should always think about and remember as we're now questioning why Arab American studies might be occluded from that. So I grew up in that household, you know, where I was taken to Palestine pretty regularly from the time I was, you know, in 10th grade on. And ultimately I began writing about social movements that linked African and Black studies and Palestine studies, particularly focusing on the importance of the question of Palestine and Third World liberation in general to movements like Malcolm X's Organization of African American Unity, or the Black Panther Party, or to other more contemporary organizations as well. And I also wanted to think more historically about why it was that so many African American civil rights leaders who are radical in their own right were so silent on the question of Palestine, and why it was that African American radicals like Paul Robeson or W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a communist, or Martin Luther King Jr., or Bayard Rustin, or A. Philip Randolph, why they could be not just silent on the question of Palestine, but so supportive of the Zionist movement. And so that led to sort of longer historical work on the importance of Christian Zionism to African American communities, to the relationships of African Americans to American Jews and the civil rights movement, but also to a critique of Orientalism within Black communities and Black politics in the United States at various times. Those linkages began to fray around the 1950s, partly as a result of the Black Muslim movement in the United States, which took several African Americans to North Africa and the Middle East, most prominently, of course, Malcolm X in the 1960s, but several intellectuals and religious figures before then had been going to study Orthodox Islam in Cairo at Al-Azhar University. That history also began to shift when a new generation of Black Power activists in the 1960s, many of whom were also part of the Third World Liberation Front in higher education, began to question the sort of implicit or complicit, I should say, the complicity of civil rights politics to US empire. And as they began to disentangle the relationship of civil rights to US imperialism, they began to link up with movements across the third world, not only African decolonization movements or Latin American decolonization movements, but in many cases with the Palestine Liberation Organization, which at that time was also struggling mightily to internationalize the struggle for justice in Palestine. So in my work, I think about how it is that transnational coalitions have historically and in the present thought about Palestine as an important subject, not only to theorize what human rights are, to theorize what the possibilities and limits of nationalist movements might be, to theorize how inclusion into a US imperial formation has both promise politically as well as pitfalls politically, but also to think about how Palestinians have shaped understandings of what liberation have been for groups like the Black Panther Party, for groups like eventually the Black Lives Matter movement. So there has always been this sort of transit back and forth on of Palestine and certain liberation movements in the West and in the United States in particular. So sort of moving beyond the question of my own work in Black Palestine solidarity, I think it's also important to recognize that when we think about categories like Arab American, or we think about the 4 core ethnic groups that can be studied in the revised ethnic studies curriculum in California, that we're talking about, as Amira said, very historically specific categories that change over time. And to think that Arab American studies is not also a part of, or can be a part of, Black studies, or that Arab American studies is not also part of Asian American studies, or even Latino studies, as Sarah Galtieri's work demonstrates, is to misunderstand, I think, some of the historical contingencies of Arab American racial formation, which is something that Amira has outlined so well. So the point being that the category Arab American can also include Black studies. And another area that I think is important to consider is that there are, of course, Arab Jews, and who might also consider themselves part of an Arab American constellation or identity. Now, I know what real politics looks like, and what we know is that in the contemporary political moment, and perhaps even we could say a longer period from the 1970s onward, Arab American has been highly racialized through the lens of terrorism and US geopolitical interests. And that has foreclosed any kind of consideration of the relational politics, something that Keith Feldman writes about so beautifully in his book, but the relational politics that have linked Arab Americans to Black, Latino, Asian American, and other racial and ethnic communities. Because Arab American has been marked as this targeted category for counterinsurgency, policing, and politics, as Amira pointed out. And so I just want to think about one other transnational moment that's both about a transnational moment in counterinsurgency policing under the War on Terror, but also a counterinsurgency moment of new possibilities for transnational solidarities. We are marking today, or at least 2 days ago, the 6-year anniversary of the police murder of Mike Brown in St. Louis, in Ferguson, I should say. And we know that in the protests following that police shooting, that police murder, that that protesters, primarily Black protesters in Ferguson, were faced with the sort of full power of a militarized police system that used tanks, armored tanks, machine guns, all that had been brought to Ferguson through a Department of Defense program that allowed for surplus from the US war on terror to come back to US police communities. We also know that the Ferguson Police Department had participated, at least many members had participated in something called the Law Enforcement Exchange Program, the LEAP program, which is sponsored by the Israeli state to train US police forces on how to do anti-terror counterinsurgency policing. US forces and police captains like those in Ferguson, Missouri, had trained in Israel, in Tel Aviv, in Jenin, in the occupied West Bank, on tactics of counterinsurgency policing that they brought back to places like Ferguson. We know that the tear gas that was thrown at protesters in Ferguson had also been used and was left over from the tear gas that had been used by US forces in Iraq and that had been used by US and Israeli forces in the West Bank. So there's a transnational relationship that's already embedded in the forces of US counterinsurgency policing that has become something of the norm in domestic cities. But something else happened in the undertow of that counterinsurgency militarization, and that is that protesters, primarily Black Lives Matter protesters in Ferguson, began to see and identify similarities with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who had been suffering from the same tear gas, from the same counterinsurgency policing, from the same mechanics of US and Israeli settler colonialism. And so the stories about Palestinians reaching out to Ferguson protesters has only led to a flourishing, right, as Noura Erakat has recently called it, a flourishing of transnational solidarity between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Palestine Solidarity Movement. A flourishing that has allowed for, in Ferguson, Missouri, one of the protesters to now become their Democratic nominee for Congress, Cori Bush, who has endorsed the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, in part because of the transnational solidarity that came out of that moment. So I guess what I'm calling for in the ongoing debate about ethnic studies in K-12 communities, or about Palestine and in the ethnic studies curriculum, is attention to the kinds of transnational solidarities that are already foundational and have always been foundational to conceptions of fields like Black studies and ethnic studies in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of what you shared, both the personal experiences as well as a lot of the information. And I was really thinking a lot about the reciprocity of struggle and how over time that's really, nourished so many transnational movements. So thank you for raising all of that. Our next speaker is going to be Dylan Rodriguez, who's the president of the American Studies Association. He's currently the faculty elected chair of the UC Riverside Academic Senate and also a professor in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at UC Riverside. He's coming out with a new book, White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare and the Logic of Racial Genocide, which is going to be out this fall. And he also has a long history of co-editing and editing critical ethnic studies readers, as well as titles such as Forced Passages, Imprisoned Radical Intellectuals in the US Prison Regime, as well as Suspended Apocalypse, White Supremacy, Genocide, and the Filipino Condition. So please help me in welcoming Dylan.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be part of this illustrious group of folks, and I'm really honored to be in conversation with everyone else who's also here. let me start with a short reflection based on what Alex just said about counterinsurgency. It reminds me of a conversation I was having with a group of people just yesterday. I really appreciate the fact that Alex is thinking about this continuity of militarized policing as counterinsurgency from, from Israel, or sorry, from Palestine to Ferguson. It forces us to think deeply about the continuities of police power more generally. And I want to say this, let me preface my comments this way, because this kind of situates where I'm coming from analytically, politically, intellectually, and so forth. School administrations, whether it's K through 12, universities, colleges, JCs, et cetera, school administrations are part of the police. Police are part of school administrations. They are not separate. We see this more and more now. We saw it with the graduate student wildcat strike at UC Santa Cruz, where there was a series of direct collaborations and interaction and dialogue between the university administration and not just the campus police force, but the entire University of California system police force, as well as local police forces. You see a reporting relationship, meaning a power mapping that would show us that school administrations and police are in a continuity with each other. That's my way of framing this moment and the stakes of what we're talking about today and this week. In thinking about what's happening to the California Ethnic Studies curriculum, what's happening to it is an administrative police action. That's the only way that I can frame this. I think it's the most appropriate way to frame it. And we have to treat it as such. This is nothing less than an administrative police action. And I'm hoping that my comments can kind of shed a little bit more light on how that maybe amplifies the stakes of what we do and say, and brings us to the table in that meeting on Thursday that I hope will be a transformative and productively interruptive meeting. So I want to start my comments, which I'll try to keep short because I want to get into the discussion with everybody who's here. I want to start by thanking, first of all, the original committee, the authors, the friends of the Ethnic Studies curriculum that has since been bureaucratically gutted by the so-called Instructional Quality Commission. We all owe you a debt of gratitude. I'm thankful to you for creating this moment of fight for all of us. I'm also obviously incredibly grateful to that group for synthesizing all the intellectual and pedagogical creative labor that's gone into building ethnic studies over the last half century or so and turning it into a viable curriculum. And I know that it's gonna really gather a lot of steam for us to defend it, to fight it, to protect it. So when thinking about the issues at stake in this discussion and in this conflict, I actually was forced to reflect on how I've been doing some version of the collective labor, the organizing, the activism, the creative thinking around ethnic studies for more than 25 years. I say that, I also want to say I do not consider myself an elder. I don't consider myself old, but I do say that in the hope that you'll accept these short remarks as my attempt at an overview of the directions that I see ethnic studies taking over these last 25 or so years, and why it's so critical to be protecting, defending, and advancing the field, and not more than the field, the praxis, the project, the movement of Arab American studies, in this work. So, qualification of my part of this discussion. I enter this conversation, I am part of this conversation as a student of Arab American studies. I'm nothing more than that. I'm especially a student and an admirer of the people who are here in this virtual room, from my co-panelists, Amira Jarmakani and Keith Feldman, to some of the friends and colleagues that I saw on the participant list in the crowd, in this virtual crowd, including Nadine Neighbor, Sophia Arman, Swad Joseph, other names I recognize, and other names that, I would recognize you if I saw you. So at its best, as again, a colleague and a student of Arab American studies, I view it as an anti-colonial project. I view it as an expression of dense scholarly rigor, of intellectual creativity, of collective genius. In other words, as a form of thriving that claims a place in the society and in history that we all inhabit in K through 12 classrooms and beyond. In other words, this is an expression of a particular way of being human. It is nothing more, nothing less than that. That is why it is so deeply anti-colonial, because it is an expression of being human against occupation, against conquest, against militarized repression. So as an anti-colonial project at its best, I honor, I value, and I protect Arab American studies, not only because it represents a radical and liberation-focused critical analysis of the colonial occupation of land, culture, and life worlds, but also because it represents a radical analysis of state strategies of mandated liberal inclusion, including watered down multiculturalism. And the way in which it conducts that analysis is it reveals how it is that watered down liberal multiculturalism not only is insufficient to anti-colonialism, but is actually part of colonialism, right? That liberal multiculturalism, including this bullshit curriculum that's being advanced toward us as a gutted version of what our colleagues put together. This is reproducing the colonial relations of power that make up California and the United States more generally. It's nothing less than that. So I want to say that what compounds that critical focus on these assumptions that construct California, meaning the colonial assumptions that construct California and the United States. We have to contextualize where we're at in this discussion globally, right? We have to look at how this ethnic studies curriculum is under review while the world around us, on this, all over the planet and around us, is in the midst of a Black liberationist, Black radical, Black feminist, Black queer, and abolitionist-led global revolt against policing, against anti-Black state violence, to a significant extent against colonial violence, racial colonial violence generally. Right, that's the condition in which we are having the discussion, is the summer of 2020. Not long from now, succeeding generations will be asking us what the summer of 2020 was like. Where were you on June 1st, 2020? What street were you on? That's the condition in which this is happening. And so here's my point in raising the fact that we're in a moment of global diasporic Black radical revolt. As with every historical moment in which Black radical, Black liberationist revolt surges into a leading global role, it tends to create a lot more room, more latitude for adjoining, allied, and contemporaneous movements to expand their reach and their influence, right? This is the part of the Black radical tradition, right? Is that it's so profoundly generous in inviting all oppressed peoples to engage not only with the work of Black radicalism, but to seize on the traditions and the logics of autonomy and self-determination that Black liberation represents. So we're in a moment like this. This is why the state, meaning the state of California, meaning this so-called Instructional Quality Commission, all these folks, right? The state and all of its administrative arms and all of its peoples. This is why the state knows overtly and implicitly that they should actually, in a sense, be scared shitless of what might happen on the street and in the classroom. I think what we're seeing happen with the gutting of this curriculum is that symptom of administrators being scared shitless of what might happen in the classroom, and how what might happen in the classroom might go beyond that classroom, right? And how they might be held responsible for it, because now people might actually be willing to struggle for a more radical version of their freedom, autonomy, and self-determination. That's part of this. And I think we have to have that front and center if we're going to be realistic about why it's happening. So a couple more points I'll make, and this is in response to my amazing colleagues that just spoke. So I feel like most of what I'm saying is really a response to them. I have nothing original to say here. I'm just responding to my folks here. There's another basic antagonism that I immediately saw reflected in the process, the protocols, and the decisions that were made by this so-called Instructional Quality Commission and this, I guess, the subcommittee, the History, Social Science Subject Matter Committee, right? Anyway, these are the fools that gutted the curriculum. And that is that what they've done reflects how it is that the anti-colonial, the Black radical, the feminist, the queer, the trans liberation project that characterize the best work and the most current work in ethnic studies is completely at odds with the purposes of dominant or hegemonic California state schooling, right? And I say schooling, not education. Schooling is different from education, right? Let's talk about schooling, right? That the best and most current work in ethnic studies is fundamentally at odds with the purposes of hegemonic state schooling. I said it again, right? The state, as a generalized intent, wants to cohere, suture, and soothe political inequities, asymmetries of power. It wants to re-narrate and bring to some kind of happy conclusion the histories of racial, colonial, and anti-Black state violence. And that's the way it does this is through liberal multiculturalism, inclusionism, and usually implicitly Zionist versions of school curricula, right? That's what tends to be endorsed by the state. Now, on the other hand, the most serious and committed scholars and teachers of ethnic studies do forms of critical education that think about these inequities, asymmetries, and violence as historical conditions of everyday life for the majority of people on the planet, including and particularly Palestinians over the last ongoing 70 plus years into a century, right? That is the fundamental difference here. And in doing that kind of work, what I think those of us that consider ourselves practitioners and workers in ethnic studies, we're trying to nurture an intellectual autonomy from anti-Black, racial, colonial, and white supremacist structures of learning and teaching. That is the antagonism we're in, right? What I saw y'all doing when you put that original curriculum together, it was an assertion of self-determination and autonomy. It was fucking beautiful. It was good shit, right? And that's what we need to protect and defend and advance. And what these folks have done in this instructional quality, I'm tired of saying their name, this IQC, whatever this thing is, right? What they're doing is they're waging a counterinsurgent intellectual pedagogical war. They are trying to undermine that assertion of autonomy, of self-determination, of radical freedom. So I'll just conclude by saying this. The Instructional Quality Commission and the History Social Science Subject Matter Committee, they should be fucking embarrassed over what they've done. What they've done is a massive step backwards. What they've done acts as if the last 25 to 30 years of teaching, writing, and curricular innovation in ethnic studies never happened. They are still living in this fiction that the world is composed of these 4 multicultural food groups, which in and of themselves actually don't make sense anyways, right? It's as if Pacific Islanders, by the way, are not indigenous to this hemisphere or continent. And I could go on with this. There's a kind of strident assertion of ignorance, which is reflective of the moment that we are in, right? Where folks deny the existence of a pandemic and all the way on down the line, right? They deny the existence of an ethnic studies that has been departing from and actively criticizing the multicultural liberal 4 food group paradigm for at least 25 years. And over the last 10 to 15 years has embraced an approach that does the following, right? What it does over now, what critical ethnic studies does now, what people call critical ethnic studies does now, is rather than foreground imaginary pre-existing racial ethnic groups as if they're coherent units of society, which they never are, right? What critical ethnic studies work is doing now is it focuses on complex relations of power, violence, and war that constitute the lives of most of the people on the planet, right? I'm talking about centering the relations of power that crystallize in institutions like chattel slavery, like racial colonialism, including settler colonialism, but not exclusive to that, right? There's franchise colonialism, there's all different forms of colonialism. Policing and incarceration, border militarization, imperial war, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and ableism as colonial and anti-Black structures, and so forth. So what we're seeing here is that what our struggle is against here is it's against an institutionalization of ethnic studies as an extension of the state. What we are fighting for is a particular way of knowing that has to be asserting a sense of autonomy. It has to be asserting histories, testimonials, poems, anti-colonial messages, which are characteristic of Arab American and Pacific Islander studies, particularly because they destroy the superficial, flimsy stories of liberal multicultural California. So finally, I want to just be very clear in echoing my colleagues that have spoken so far. This repression of Arab American studies in the ethnic studies curriculum is openly driven by a Zionist logic of impunity. It is replicating a Zionist logic of apartheid. It is attempting to erase Arab and particularly Palestinian knowledge, history, and existence. And I, for one, will not fucking stand for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really helpful that you put those comments in the context of the rebellions that are happening now and the counterinsurgency that is being waged by our institutions against that. So thank you very much, Dylan. Folks were, I think we all knew that this was going to be a really powerful panel, but folks were really on point. So I appreciate everyone's comments, and you've made my job both very easy and very hard. It's very easy because I'm actually not going to say much and just kind of throw a couple things that I jotted down as you were speaking kind of back at you and just give folks the opportunity to respond. But you're also making my job hard because you went over so much. I just kind of throw a couple things at you and see what happens. So a couple of things that really resonated that I was thinking back at you of dialogue, and then folks can also just say anything that they were inspired by or might have missed based on other people's comments. But a couple of things that really strike me are, at the heart of this, the importance of young people. And I know that all of you are teachers. And so I'm thinking in terms of, as we're using ethnic studies as a way to challenge state supremacy and white supremacy and anti-Zionism, how do your roles as teachers, how do you see young people playing a role in this, or just how do you see that fitting in, so that we can try to bring some of them at least, tangentially into the conversation. The other thing, and I'm looking at a couple of questions that came in as I'm thinking about this. One of the things that folks spoke very clearly about throughout all of your presentations was using really descriptive and powerful language like anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, self-determination. These are words that we don't often hear in education, public education nowadays, for reasons that all of you raised. But it also makes me think of so many of your points were grounded in the histories and studies and language we use are specific to certain historical moments and periods. And as things change, we also change. And so I'm wondering, how do you folks see ethnic studies changing as political and social contexts have changed? And so as an example, thinking about terms that now exist like SWANA that previously did not exist, and how do we incorporate these things into this larger study? Many of you have spoken to pieces of this, but I just want to raise this as some questions that were coming from the audience. And then the final thing I just wanted to raise, just as my own personal reflection, I appreciate the folks raising indigeneity, and in terms of just thinking about erasure, I was lucky enough to have visited Palestine, and when I was there, we saw a lot of evidence of the indigeneity of Palestinians literally being erased from the environment and the landscape, and how that legitimizes Zionist narratives that folks were never there in the first place. And so I just appreciate that being named, and I think it's another important piece, because that's many of the struggles we see today. I'm thinking specifically around like statues and monuments kind of speak to that. So I really appreciate everyone's comments. Maybe if we just want to go through and maybe the order we started with and just give folks to kind of say what they want to say, and then I'll wrap up at the end with kind of next steps.
Wow, that's a tall order. Does that mean I go first? Thanks so much for your wonderful questions that bring up so many kinds of things. And I'm not sure, actually, I mean, not questions, but comments that help us, follow up on different threads. I was also laughing at when Dylan said, you don't consider yourself old, and Allison, if I may, in the comments wrote that we're now yelders. So your comment and your comment about young people and the question there also made me think about all of the ways in which there's so many struggles that have been led. I would think of it not so much as a question of like, well, how can young people plug in, but how have young people, depending on how you're defining young, led a lot of the kinds of movements and things that have gotten, what encapsulates Arab American studies and what it's interested in looking at to the forefront, and also bringing Palestine as well, and also faced the brunt of a lot of backlash in that respect. So I'm thinking, for instance, of Students for Justice in Palestine and the Palestinian Youth Movement, and the targeting of these groups in particular and of students by Canary Mission, which somebody also had named in the chat. And oh, I see you, Yelders, that's awesome. Yeah, that targeting by Canary Mission, which seems to have also like really particularly gone after students and also people who are at the beginning of their career. And so I think there are also lots of questions to be asked and discussed about how to collaborate in relation to that. And then also just to quickly say something on the SWANA thing, and here kind of going to the question that was asked by Sandy Somo, and there's like a two-part question there, basically asking like, is there a reason why we're asking for Arab American studies rather than Southwest Asian and North African or SWANA studies? And of course, like that has to do with the fact that Arab American as a category can't actually encapsulate all of what Arab American studies is interested in looking at. And you can see that even in the naming of some of the programs, that there are programs that also name like the Arab ethnicities and Muslim diasporas program and the Arab and Muslim studies program, that there are all kinds of supple, flexible ways that we need to think about racialization and these processes of like which groups get all lumped together, conflated together in academic jargon, and how to strategically think about how would we be better served, as Sandy asked in the second part of that question. You know, some of the, I was thinking about that when Dylan was speaking and toward the end, and pointing out and really highlighting the ways that these four groups that were originally named, of course, and other folks, Christine and Alex and Keith, have all spoken to the way that these four groups change and shift over time, and they were never meant to be static, rigid groups. And we would have to think in the same way about that category, SWANA. And even I think we could link SWANA back to the question about young people and the ways that configuration was brought to us, I think, in many ways through kinds of activism related to, for instance, student activism. For instance, Neda Meghbouli talks about in her book, The Limits of Whiteness, how there were struggles by students, I believe in the UC system, to get SWANA named as a category, which could have then, you know, perhaps led to it as a kind of configuration that had more traction, but it doesn't really have that traction at this point in many, at least in mainstream settings, right? So let me step back and let others chime in.
So if we're going to go in sequence, I'll just offer a few remarks. You know, I was also just thinking about this particular historical moment and the kind of self-evident urgency of having a critical ethnic studies curriculum in this particular historical juncture, but to recognize that this incredible moment in which the work of the people who were part of the advisory committee that put together the draft curriculum and the communities that they represent and the long histories and legacies and the kind of activist trajectories that are behind them, how this also represents a moment of peril. And I'm reminded of what Dylan was stating, which is that, you know, basically this is a moment in which we see how institutionalization works and how it allows for hegemonic articulations of radical projects for co-optation. And even if you look, for example, and I'm sure, Nathaniel, you've seen that 1974 document at the UC Berkeley Ethnic Studies Library about, you know, like a few years in, right? Like it's a few years in after ethnic studies has been launched, there have been divide and conquer strategies. There has been so much. There is the tenure process. There's all manner of things that made it so that some of the people who were at the heart of that entire struggle, who were essential to understanding ethnic studies as praxis, were pushed out. And in many cases, unable to make it through that, like, tenure process, ended up doing other things, including, driving the Muni bus, etc., doing many different things within the community. But it's just to say that institutionalization represents a very perilous moment. I'm also reminded, like, this kind of moment in which so many different corporate brands are adopting the language of anti-racism, and you see every single academic, every administration of every academic institution of higher education coming out with statements critiquing anti-Blackness, critiquing, coming out with like statements about anti-racism, and but realizing that it's not inconsistent for those same administrations to defund Black studies, to, one scholar, Nick Mitchell, speaks about how ethnic studies in institutions of, higher education represented the moment in which there was a casualization of academic labor in the form of lecturers, and that's not a coincidence. And so just to be mindful that this is not a new pattern, it's one that is all too familiar. And I guess I think in terms of anti-imperialism, Nathaniel, which you mentioned, is a kind of term that isn't so commonly used. It's also, I think, very sobering to realize that a lot of the radical project of the TWLF movement hasn't been realized. And if you think too that at SF State, part of the student struggle had to do also with the school administration giving the government, the federal government, information about draft age male students who had failed their classes, and there was a critique of the university's centrality and collusion to the military-industrial complex. Now that's a discussion that remains to be had, in a robust way. And right now we're at this very interesting moment where ethnic studies, which has been largely realized as a college sort of project, and in sort of, different sort of manifestations been realized in K through 12, has the opportunity to be realized statewide in various sort of, ways. But it represents a kind of moment in which we are speaking out to maintain the criticality of the ethnic studies project.
So I'll just be real brief. These presentations have been so great, so illuminating, and just full of such richness and critical acumen. So my mind is going at like 1,000 miles an hour. I do want to say just briefly to echo something that and build on something that Christine said, and echo and build on something that Dylan said. The first is about institutionalization, right? And that we, in a certain sense, should not be at all surprised that that a state agency in the state of California in the United States would be offering up this inclusionary model that runs absolutely counter to the kinds of critical, scholarly, and activist-oriented liberatory work that ethnic studies has long held and forged, right? That should not be at all a surprise to us, that that's what's coming from from a state agency, to the tensions in institutionalization. I think, Christine, you're using the word peril, and I think that's spot on, right? Because there are such rich opportunities, and I tried to name some of the opportunities that the Arab Studies model curriculum outline really offer us for the kind of experience that K-12, particularly 9 through 12 students might experience in California. I think that's such a rich opportunity, right? And at the same time, right, because of the ways in which the state operates, and I'm really keen to sort of think with Dylan a little bit about thinking about universities and institutions of education or institutions of schooling as administrative police actions and operating through that logic, right? We shouldn't be surprised at the kind of defanging of this work that had called quite explicitly, that calls quite explicitly for a kind of liberatory commitment to self-determination and an anti-imperialist commitment transnationally. And I guess the second thing I'd say, just to pick up on something that Dylan mentioned, is that kind of along with this fight for ethnic studies in California, at least, right, that another development that we're engaging in is a long-standing flourishing and fruition of abolitionist theory and praxis coming to play in having folks really ask critical questions in municipalities, on university campuses, in high schools, about the role of police and policing, and the constitutive inability of the institutions as they're currently articulated to support and sustain and enable the care of for all communities, and communities of color in particular, right? So as we just think about the kind of the nexus that this struggle is taking place in, it's worth also reminding ourselves of the ways in which communities, organizations, folks in higher ed, folks in high schools are really demanding different kinds of relationships to community safety and different definitions to senses of care and community, right? And I think the fight for a liberatory sense of Arab American studies and a liberatory sense of ethnic studies is part of that project. It's part of that kind of flourishing of a commitment to one another against the powers of state-sanctioned violence to continually kind of delimit possibilities. I'll leave my comments there.
So I think it's my turn. I'm going to be, can you hear me? Yes, okay, sorry. I'm going to just be very brief here because I have enjoyed listening to what all the panelists have said already in relation to these questions. As Amira said, as a way for younger people to get involved in these politics, which was one of the questions you posed, Nathaniel, I think it is important to note that there are groups like SJP. Check out Nora Barros-Friedman's book about SJP if you're interested, that has played a really critical role for the last couple decades and carrying forward the work of Arab American activists long before then. But it is notable, I think, that there are a range of organizations now where one can turn to learn more about Palestine solidarity and justice justice in Palestine politics, from the Black Lives Matter movement to the indigenous politics in groups like the Red Nation that come out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I was before coming to here to Penn State. The other thing that I would just say is that, thinking about Dylan's really generative, excellent comments, that Palestine remains something of a taboo, as Edward Said called it, even today. It's a discussion we could have had 30 years ago, probably, and it would look very similar, except the field of ethnic studies obviously would look different at that different historical conjuncture. But we could have had this conversation long ago and it would look similar. And one of the things that Said had argued, but I think even more recently, the late, great Amy Kaplan argued in her last book, is that Americans can't quite comprehend Palestine because they can't quite recognize the settler colonial violence at the core of their own societies. And so the absence of, to get to your question, Nathaniel, about indigeneity, the absence of an understanding of Israeli settler colonialism vis-a-vis Palestinian indigeneity is the text that cannot be recognized in a society that fails and has never yet grappled with its own settler colonial history, with its own indigenous presence among it. So those two occlusions are both violent, and they are both, I think, related and productive to each other. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
I'll focus my comments on the part of the question that had to do with, I don't know, advise might be the word, but I don't know, drawing from experience and wisdom might be the other phrase for students, emerging generation or generations of people that are getting engaged with this particular struggle, as well as other forms of, so-called social justice, but really radical liberationist, freedom-oriented, anti-colonial, Black radical type struggles. I have a couple points on that. And one is, school administrations, I think, are most productively terrified by the notion of mass student mobilization. And a close second place behind that is a mobilization of not necessarily a mass of students, but of deeply committed, deeply informed, and principled students who have allies beyond the school. That's what tends to force the hand of counterinsurgent school administrators. I see it over and over again. It happens over and over again. So my response to that part of your question, Nathaniel, is to say that I think students are already embracing the ethic of organizing. I think it happens every day, all the time. So I don't think there's any need for somebody like me to tell students to go organize. Y'all are doing it, right? They're doing it. K through 12, they're doing it. So there's no need for me to encourage that. I will say this though, and this is, coming out of my own experience as a student activist, as well as somebody who teaches student organizers and activists and mentors them and works with them and tries to have their back in all the different kind of ways. When students undertake organizing now, I really want to encourage them to do so with a commitment to building a clarity of institutional analysis every step of the way. In other words, it's not, organizing in and of itself is not necessarily good or bad, right? It can be pretty cool when you start, but it can quickly get tracked into bullshit if you don't have a clarity and a commitment to a clarity of institutional analysis every single step. That means that part of what you need to meet and convene around is to do the analysis, right? Not just to think about what the next steps are going to be pragmatically or what the next action is going to be, but you have to build an analysis. And this analysis, I would argue, is most productive and frankly most fun to build when you're guided by radical desires for liberation rather than bureaucratic pragmatism, right? And I say bureaucratic pragmatism because that is the framework that school administrators will try to cultivate as a solution to student demands and student mobilizations. They will bombard you with various forms of bureaucratic measures. They will ask you to join a focus group or a working group or a task force or something like that. And you have to have an analysis of the institution that says, that, for example, to the extent we're going to participate in that task force over there, we understand its limitations and we're sending one of our members over there and they're going to do this. But you have to have a broader sense of what you're doing and how to do it so that you don't get sucked into this bureaucratic kind of mundane pragmatism that kills movements. And then finally, I'll say this, and this is a call out to my colleagues, particularly my colleagues who have, who are so-called senior faculty, who are tenured, but really to any colleague who is a teacher. I really urge students to identify the faculty, the teachers around you that will mentor, advise, and protect you. And I think part of our obligation as teachers is to do that mentoring, that advising, and that protecting in all the different ways you want to interpret those words: mentoring, advising, and protecting. I think that is something we're obligated to do. And many of us are in a position where we have no excuse not to do everything possible militantly to mentor, advise, and protect student organizing. So I say that as somebody who comes from a campus where I believe the majority of the so-called Irvine 11, the people, the students that were criminalized and, prosecuted by the DA for a nonviolent disruption of a genocidal Israeli state official's speech at UC Irvine. I mean, the majority of the Irvine 11 were actually UC Riverside students, right? And so I know how serious it is to be in a position of trying to advise, protect, and mentor students who are under the eye of, a politically repressive state, both locally and globally. But that's what I think we're obligated to do. That's a call out to all of us who are teachers.
Thank you all for your comments. And, I really think I think it really speaks to the fact that we don't have an analysis of state strategy, or that we don't know as much about it. I think speaks to the desperate need for things like ethnic studies and real political education for our young people. So I just want to take the opportunity as we're wrapping up to just say thank you again to all the panelists who took their time to be with us and shared all their wonderful perspectives and information, to the organizers of this webinar, and to also the original writers of the model curriculum that put together such a robust document that we are fighting for. So appreciate to all of those parties of people. And I just want to say, as kind of a campaign update, on Thursday, the Instructional Quality Committee is meeting of the California Department of Education. They're going to engage the most recent iteration of insufficient revisions to this curriculum. You can visit SaveArabAmericanStudies.org, which is our website, to get information about how you can submit public comment or speak to state folks before the meeting on Thursday. And I think that one of the things I really just want to raise is that a lot of the struggle is also going to take place after Thursday, where we really have to push to make sure that we build the curriculum that folks today have been speaking of, and we know will speak to the tenets and pedagogy of ethnic studies. So I want to say thank you again to everyone. It's been really great to be here, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Thanks for facilitating this, Nathaniel.
Of course.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.